Well, welcome back to session 3 of Refuge. Naomi and her family went down to Moab. Tragedy struck there. She lost her husband, her 2 sons. One of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, decided to stay in Moab, where she was from. And Ruth has followed Naomi back to Bethlehem. So we pick up the story in chapter 2. Naomi is geographically back home. She's back in Bethlehem, but emotionally and spiritually, she's still far from home. What is God going to do next to bring her back to himself? While simultaneously, God, the ultimate multitasker, while simultaneously showing his love, his true nature to Ruth, who grew up worshiping different gods. This is a great part of the story. Let's pick it up in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Boaz is a close relative, and according to the scripture here, a man of good standing or good character. In fact, his name, Boaz, literally means mighty man. We would expect what comes next in verse 2 to talk more about Boaz, but it doesn't. He's just mentioned, introduced, and then he's dropped. At first reading, this seems like kind of an irrelevant tangent. I mean, immediately the focus shifts back to Naomi and Ruth. But the writer is skillful. He's foreshadowing that there is hope for Naomi. The writer skillfully dangles this tidbit of information about this man named Boaz. It'll be interesting to see if we hear more about him later. Verse 2 shifts right back to the flow, to the action. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." You know, there's 8 times that Ruth is referred to as the Moabite. This is one of them here, Ruth, the Moabite. 8 times. Either Ruth the Moabite or Ruth from Moab. Plus, she even refers to herself as a foreigner. That's a major theme of this. She's an outsider. She's kind of an uninvited guest there. Ruth takes the initiative in this story, though, in providing for herself and Naomi. It's her idea. Why don't I go glean? Why don't I go see if I can find us some food? We would expect that Naomi would be the one who would bring this up. It's back in her home. But I think this shows us just how broken and hurting Naomi truly is. This would have been unusual for a woman, let alone a foreigner, to take this kind of initiative. Her behavior is not the norm. It'll be interesting to see if God blesses this action-oriented female foreigner. Can he even use her initiative to provide for one of his daughters, Naomi, who really believes he's forgotten her? What Ruth is suggesting is a common practice called gleaning. It's to follow the harvesters through a field after they've finished their work and pick up the leftover grain. It's one of the ways that God provided for those who were struggling to survive. Check out this clear instruction in the scriptures to those who are blessed enough to have grain to harvest. It's found in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. God says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over the vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor, and look at this, the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." So no doubt this was common in the culture. Ruth has heard about this. It may not have been limited to just Israel, but she's the one who initiates this. She's the one who makes this suggestion. In verse 3, then it says, "So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out," we'll come back to that phrase in a minute, "as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to none other than our friend Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." So he's related to Ruth's former husband. Verse 4, "Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. God brings Boaz and Ruth together. Those little phrases, "as it happened," or "just then." What a coincidence. Of all the fields Ruth could have chosen. Remember, Naomi didn't go, "Hey, I've got a relative. His name is Boaz. Why don't you go glean in his field?" This is purely Ruth initiating all this. And it just so happens that she picks the field of Boaz. And what do you know? Just then, Boaz, who's wealthy evidently, doesn't work in the fields every day himself. Just then, Boaz happens to show up. You know, over in the Step Into the Story column, I love this quote. It says, "A coincidence is sometimes a miracle where God chooses to remain anonymous." Isn't that a cool idea? You know, God is not the emphasis in this book. He's not named over and over. He's not the one as the cause behind all this. And yet His fingerprints are all over this story. His DNA of God raising up people, of God using and creating situations to care for these women. It's just, the DNA is unmistakable. Verse 5 goes on and says, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. You know, two things we want to notice here. First of all, the overseer identifies Ruth as a Moabite. Again, this is one of the 8 times. This is just how she's labeled. This is how her identity is defined. Ruth from Moab. Ruth, not from around here. Ruth, the foreigner. But the overseer doesn't stop there. Aside from just identifying where she's from, the overseer reports that Ruth is both polite and hardworking. She's asked for permission to glean. She doesn't have any sense of entitlement. And the overseer says, and she's worked really hard. She started in the morning and she hasn't stopped, all morning long, except for just a brief break, to get some shade. This is so instructive to us, I think. We all have a tendency to lump people into categories. In some ways, this is fine because it's one of the ways we make sense out of our world. We organize the overwhelming bits of information that are flying at us, and so we sort situations, we recognize patterns, and we place people in categories. That's not bad in all ways, but there is a downside to that, as we can unconsciously ascribe certain characteristics to everyone who belongs to that group. In the last few years, God has been convicting me about this topic, about my unconscious, unintentional perpetuation of ethnic stereotypes, for instance, even if they're positive. To say things like, look at a resume or a name and go, oh good, she's Asian. You know she's going to be a hard worker, and you know she's going to be great with details. Well, what if she happens to be a person who's way more of a big picture thinker, but instead to take characteristics that I've observed with some that now I apply to all? That's really not that great. Or to tell jokes, not terrible ethnic jokes, but I've not had that much trouble with that. God dealt with that a long time ago in my life. But things that just seem to be harmless to everybody, like blonde jokes, for instance, when in reality those things can actually be hurtful to others. It's like I'll think I've got this area of my life figured out, and God will let me rest for a while, and then He'll peel off another layer of the onion. And it's an area that even today I'm still continuing to learn more about. Nothing overtly racist, nothing bad motives that I'm aware of, but I'm trying to stop reinforcing the implicit bias against people different than me. You know what? That implicit bias, lives in all of us. In this story, the overseer chose to look past the label of Moabite and focus on the true character of Ruth. When I read these simple verses where he describes Ruth's qualities, I can't help but think of Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, Dr. King pastored Ebenezer Baptist Church right here in Atlanta, where I'm from. And in perhaps his most momentous speech in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., at the heart of the Civil Rights Movement, in maybe his most iconic quote ever, Dr. King said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." We've made some progress since the 60s, to be sure. We've also still got a long way to go. But Dr. King's dream is still alive. I can't help but think when I read this story that Boaz's humble overseer did his part to help Israel move one step closer to being the kind of nation Dr. King dreamed that our country will one day become. The story continues in verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." Women, especially foreign women, were so vulnerable to violence, to sexual assault. And Boaz assures Ruth of his provision and protection. Verse 10, this is her response. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. Not just a little nod, a full expression of gratitude and humility. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Ruth responds with humility and gratitude. Boaz answers her question in verse 11. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother, your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz knows all about Ruth, and he blesses her. And he uses a really beautiful word picture. It's a picture of a mother bird guarding her nest. Her precious eggs or her new hatched little chicks are underneath there. And there's the mother, and that bird, you've probably seen photos of this, that mother bird will shelter from, there might be a terrible storm going on, but underneath her eggs or her little chicks are perfectly safe. And that's the picture that Boaz uses of God's love. What's unique, though, is Boaz understands that God's wings are wide enough for even a foreigner. That's not something that was a commonly held cultural view. God has, from the beginnings of Scripture, even early on when He called out a people to be His own people, He's made it very clear that you are not my pet people, you are to be my pattern people. Ultimately, through this people, we find out the Jewish nation. But God says, I will bless every people group on the planet. And Boaz is one of those rare people who seems to really get the heart of God. Verse 13, Ruth responds, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Boaz's behavior was rare and countercultural. He shows no hint of xenophobia. Are you familiar with that word? It's a big word under discussion today in our culture and really around the world. Over in the Step Into the Story column in your workbook, you can see that xenophobia is defined as dislike or prejudice toward people from other countries. It's an aversion or hostility or fear of foreigners or people from different cultures. We may not even be aware of this, but to a degree, this is something that lives in all of us, because like attracts life, and I'm just more comfortable with people who talk like I do, behave like I do, maybe even dress like I do. I can't help but wonder, why was Boaz able to rise above xenophobia? I mean, given the history of Moab and Israel, centuries of conflict. Lot had settled in Moab after splitting from his uncle Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. Moab's king Balak opposed Moses when he was leading the people to the promised land after the Exodus leaving Egypt. Judges 3 records the account of Moab's king Eglon oppressing Israel. That's the time of the Judges. That's not that long before this story takes place. Given this history, what motivated Boaz to treat Ruth the Moabite with such compassion and generosity? Well, part of the answer is spelled out directly in this passage. He says, I heard about Ruth, your love and commitment to your mother-in-law Naomi. Naomi happened to be Boaz's own relative, so certainly this would incline his heart toward her. But I think there's another reason. We have to leave the book of Ruth to find it and look bigger in the Bible story. I believe Boaz was also influenced by his own family's experience. He descended from Salmon and Rahab, the Bible tells us, was a Canaanite prostitute. We read about her in the book of Joshua. Some of the spies during the conquest hid in her house that was part of the wall around Jericho. Rahab hid the 2 spies and then helped them escape to safety. And when Joshua's army conquered Jericho, her life was spared. Hebrews 11 celebrates her act of faith. That's great, but I can't help but wonder if ordinary Israelites living at that time, did they really accept her? She's not one of us. She's a Canaanite. Besides that, she's a prostitute. I mean, she lied for them. Can she now also lie against us? I just can't help but wonder, did Boaz grow up seeing the devastating effects of labeling and prejudice? Did he vow to accept people from different cultures as he wished people would have accepted his family? I believe Boaz harvested insights from his own family tree. His life story caused me to think about my wife's and my family trees. Like most Americans, we are the descendants of immigrants. I mean, we're not the descendants of indigenous people. I'm not Navajo or Cherokee or Choctaw. My family came here many generations ago, but my wife is only 2nd generation American on her father's side, meaning her grandparents immigrated to the U.S. from Scotland and Ireland. This reality greatly influences our family's attitude toward today's immigrants. So the question for us in our generation is this: what insights can you glean from your own family or personal story? Not just your genealogy, but your life experience. Can you think of a time when someone you considered to be above you reached down and extended a helping hand? What difference did that make in your life? When I started with Walk Through the Bible, my first week, a man named John Hoover took me to lunch and said, let's just talk about how you navigate this place. What questions do you have for me? He was a vice president. I was a director. Just the fact that he took that interest in me. The college I attended, especially in the football program, they've built a culture that says seniors serve freshmen. They get their equipment ready. They do everything they can to make them successful. Even if the freshman turns out to be a more gifted athlete, they serve that way. What times can you think of in your life when somebody reached down, gave you a helping hand? And then the follow-up to that, what difference did that make in your life? This is going to be a rich discussion. Go for it.